The courtroom was packed, the air thick with a mix of curiosity and tension. Rows of townsfolk, reporters, and curious onlookers filled the wooden pews, whispering among themselves. The high ceilings of the old courthouse carried their murmurs, mingling with the faint hum of fluorescent lights. All eyes were fixed on Renee Evans, a striking woman in her mid-30s who sat at the defendant's table. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe ponytail, and her lips curled into a smug smirk that seemed to mock the gravity of the charges against her. It was the kind of expression that dared anyone to challenge her, as though she were untouchable. Officer Liam Carter, the man whose testimony would make or break this case, sat a few feet away. His broad shoulders were rigid, and his square jaw clenched as he avoided looking at Renee. Liam was a pillar of their small community, a veteran police officer who had served faithfully for over 15 years. But today, the weight of his profession and the trauma of recent events were etched into his face. The courtroom grew silent as Judge Meredith Hawthorne entered, her black robe flowing behind her. She was known for her no-nonsense demeanor, a reputation earned through years of presiding over the town's most contentious cases. Her gavel struck wood, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath. "This court is now in session," she announced, her voice firm and commanding. "The case of the people versus Renee Evans will continue. Counselors, are we ready to proceed?" The district attorney, a wiry man named Richard Paxton, nodded. "The prosecution is ready, Your Honor." At the defense table, Renee's lawyer, Evelyn Monroe, stood. She was a sharp, polished woman with a knack for theatrics. "The defense is ready, Your Honor." Liam felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple as Paxton rose and approached the stand. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call Officer Liam Carter to testify." The judge gestured for Liam to approach. He stood, adjusting his uniform, and made his way to the witness stand. The sound of his boots against the polished wood floor echoed in the stillness of the room. He raised his right hand and swore the oath, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside him. Once seated, Paxton began. "Officer Carter, can you recount the events of April 14th for the court?" Liam inhaled deeply, his gaze flickering to Renee for a brief moment. She was still smirking, her eyes cold and calculating. "On April 14th, I was conducting routine traffic stops along Route 7, just outside of town. At approximately 8:45 p.m., I observed a vehicle swerving erratically. I initiated a traffic stop, suspecting the driver might be impaired." Paxton nodded. "And what happened next?" "As I approached the vehicle, I noticed the driver, now identified as Renee Evans, acting unusually. She appeared calm, almost too calm, considering the circumstances. I asked for her license and registration. She complied without hesitation, but something about her demeanor felt off." Liam paused, his jaw tightening. "I asked her to step out of the vehicle for a field sobriety test. That's when she attacked me." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Judge Hawthorne's gavel quickly silenced them. "Continue, Officer Carter," she instructed. "She pulled a concealed knife from her jacket," Liam said, his voice steady but filled with underlying tension. "She lunged at me. I managed to block the first strike, but she was relentless. During the struggle, she slashed my arm and attempted to wrestle my service weapon from its holster." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Renee's smirk remained, but there was a flicker of something else, perhaps defiance or pride, in her eyes. Paxton pressed on. "And how did you manage to subdue her?" "After a brief struggle, I was able to disarm her and call for backup. She was taken into custody without further incident." "Thank you, Officer Carter." Paxton turned to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Paxton returned to his seat, Evelyn Monroe rose with a deliberate grace. She approached Liam, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Officer Carter," she began, her tone dripping with calculated skepticism, "you've painted a very dramatic picture for the court. But I'd like to delve deeper into some inconsistencies in your account. Liam's brow furrowed. Inconsistencies? Monroe paced slowly. You claim Ms. Evans attacked you with a knife. Yet the medical report indicates your injuries were superficial. Isn't it possible that this was an overreaction on your part? Liam's fists clenched under the table. An overreaction? She tried to kill me. Or, Monroe countered smoothly, she acted in self-defense. You're a trained officer, after all. Isn't it possible that Ms. Evans felt threatened and acted accordingly? Threatened? I was performing a routine traffic stop, Liam shot back. She wasn't defending herself. She was trying to end my life. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Monroe leaned in, her voice soft but insidious. Isn't it true, Officer Carter, that you have a history of using excessive force? Objection. Paxton interjected, rising from his seat. Relevance, Your Honor. Judge Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. Sustained. Ms. Monroe, stay on topic. Monroe nodded, retreating slightly but not conceding. No further questions, Your Honor. Liam exhaled, his hands gripping the edges of the stand as he waited for the judge to dismiss him. He felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, the unspoken doubts and judgments hanging heavy in the air. As he returned to his seat, he avoided looking at Renee, whose smirk had returned in full force. It was a smirk that said she believed she was untouchable, that she could manipulate the system to her advantage. The judge called for a brief recess, and Liam stepped outside to catch his breath. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and townsfolk, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony. He leaned against a pillar, his injured arm throbbing with a dull ache. Officer Carter, a voice called out. He turned to see a woman in her 60s, her face lined with worry. I just wanted to say, thank you. For everything you do. Liam nodded, offering a tight smile. Thank you, ma'am. Her words were kind, but they did little to ease the storm brewing inside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the trial was slipping out of his control, that Renee's smirk was more than just arrogance, it was a calculated act of defiance, a signal that she had something up her sleeve. As the recess ended and everyone returned to their seats, Judge Hawthorne called the courtroom to order. The defense may call its next witness. Monroe stood, her expression unreadable. The defense calls Renee Evans to the stand. Renee rose from her seat, smoothing her skirt with an air of confidence. She walked to the stand, her smirk firmly in place, and raised her right hand to take the oath. As she began her testimony, her voice was calm, almost soothing. She painted herself as a victim, a single mother trying to protect herself from an overzealous officer. Her words were carefully chosen, designed to cast doubt on Liam's account. But as she spoke, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Liam caught it. He leaned forward, his instincts telling him that something wasn't adding up. The tension in the courtroom grew as Renee's story unfolded. And then, just as she seemed to gain the upper hand, Paxton rose for his cross-examination. Ms. Evans, he began, his tone measured, you claim you acted in self-defense. Can you explain why a knife was found concealed in your jacket, along with a second blade hidden in your vehicle? Renee hesitated, her smirk faltering for the first time. I carry them for protection. As a woman, you can never be too careful. Paxton's eyes narrowed. Protection? Or premeditation? The courtroom erupted once again, the tension reaching a breaking point. Judge Hawthorne's gavel pounded against the wood, but the damage was done. The cracks in Renee's carefully constructed facade were beginning to show, and Liam felt a glimmer of hope. As the day's proceedings came to a close, Liam couldn't shake the feeling that the trial was far from over. Renee's smirk might have faltered, but her true intentions remained a mystery. And as he left the courtroom, he couldn't help but wonder what new twists and turns awaited in the days to come. The courtroom buzzed with a nervous energy as the second day of the trial commenced. The seats were once again packed with onlookers, and the tension was almost tangible. Outside, a small group of protesters had gathered, waving signs that read "Justice for Renee" and "End Police Brutality." The case had quickly become a flashpoint for the community, igniting debates about law enforcement, personal rights, and the fine line between self-defense and criminal intent. Officer Liam Carter arrived early, his jaw set and his eyes scanning the room. He carried himself with a quiet resolve, but the weight of the previous day's testimony lingered heavily on his shoulders. He knew he was up against more than just Renee Evans and her sharp-tongued lawyer. Public opinion was a fickle beast, and it seemed to be tilting in Renee's favor, despite the evidence against her. Renee sat at the defense table, radiating an unnerving confidence. Her smirk had returned, more pronounced than ever, as though she were daring the world to question her version of events. Dressed in a sleek black suit, she looked more like a poised professional than someone facing serious charges. Evelyn Monroe, her lawyer, whispered something in her ear, eliciting a small, knowing smile. Whatever they were planning, it was clear they believed it would turn the tide in their favor. As the judge entered and called the court to order, the buzz of chatter died down. Judge Hawthorne wasted no time, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "We will now resume testimony. Ms. Monroe, you may call your next witness." Evelyn Monroe stood, her heels clicking against the floor as she made her way to the center of the courtroom. The defense calls Dr. Alan Hayes to the stand. Liam frowned, his mind racing. He hadn't anticipated this. Dr. Hayes was a respected psychologist in town, known for his work with trauma victims. As the doctor took the stand, his calm demeanor and impeccable reputation seemed to command the room's respect. Monroe began her questioning with a practiced ease. "Dr. Hayes, can you explain the psychological impact of a high-stress situation on an individual like my client, Renee Evans?" Dr. Hayes nodded, folding his hands in his lap. "Of course. In high-stress situations, the body's fight-or-flight response is activated. This can lead to heightened adrenaline, impaired decision-making, and actions that might seem irrational under normal circumstances." Monroe leaned closer, her tone sympathetic. "In your professional opinion, could someone like Ms. Evans, a single mother with no prior criminal record, have acted out of sheer panic during the encounter with Officer Carter?" "It's certainly possible," Dr. Hayes replied. "If Ms. Evans perceived a threat, real or imagined, her actions could have been a result of that heightened state of panic." The courtroom seemed to hang on his every word. Liam's stomach churned. He could see how the defense was trying to twist the narrative, painting Renee as a vulnerable woman who had been pushed to the brink. But he knew the truth, the cold, unvarnished reality of her calculated actions. When the cross-examination began, Paxton wasted no time challenging Dr. Hayes. "Dr. Hayes, while I respect your expertise, isn't it true that your assessment is based solely on hypothetical scenarios? You've never spoken to Ms. Evans directly, correct?" "That's correct," Dr. Hayes admitted. "My testimony is based on general psychological principles." Paxton nodded, his tone sharpening. "And isn't it also true that heightened panic can lead to self-preservation, not aggression? Ms. Evans didn't just flee the scene, she attacked a police officer with a knife and attempted to take his weapon. That doesn't sound like panic to me. It sounds like intent." The courtroom murmured in agreement, and Judge Hawthorne banged her gavel to restore order. Dr. Hayes shifted uncomfortably but maintained his composure. "While it's unusual, extreme fear can manifest in different ways. It's not for me to determine intent, only to provide context." Liam felt a small surge of relief as Paxton pressed on, methodically dismantling the defense's attempt to frame Renee as an innocent victim. But the tension in the room was far from resolved. The defense wasn't done yet, and Liam knew they had more cards to play. When the court reconvened after a short recess, Monroe rose again, her expression smug. The defense calls Officer Carter's former partner, Detective Rachel Vargas, to the stand. Liam froze, his blood running cold. Rachel Vargas had been his partner for 5 years before transferring to a neighboring precinct. They had parted on amicable terms, or so he'd thought. Seeing her now, seated on the witness stand, sent a wave of unease through him. What could she possibly have to say? Monroe's questioning began with a disarming smile. Detective Vargas, you worked closely with Officer Carter for several years, correct? That's correct, Rachel replied, her voice steady. And in your time working together, did you ever observe Officer Carter displaying aggressive behavior or using excessive force? Rachel hesitated, glancing briefly at Liam. There were a few instances where he could be assertive. But nothing I would classify as excessive force. Monroe pounced on the word. Assertive. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that? Rachel shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. Liam is a dedicated officer. He's passionate about protecting the community. Sometimes that passion comes across as intensity. Intensity, Monroe repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Would you say that intensity could be intimidating to someone who feels vulnerable? Rachel's jaw tightened. I can't speak for how others might feel. But Liam has always acted within the bounds of the law. Monroe's smile didn't falter. Thank you, Detective Vargas. No further questions. As Rachel stepped down, she avoided meeting Liam's gaze. He couldn't shake the feeling that her testimony, while not damning, had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury. The day dragged on, each new witness adding another layer to the tangled web of the case. The prosecution called an expert in forensic evidence, who testified about the knife wounds on Liam's arm and the fingerprints found on the weapon. But the defense countered with their own expert, who suggested that the evidence could be interpreted differently. By the time the judge called for adjournment, the courtroom was buzzing with speculation. Liam felt like he was drowning in a sea of half-truths and misdirection. As he stepped outside, the cool evening air did little to calm his racing thoughts. Liam, a voice called out. He turned to see Rachel standing by the courthouse steps, her expression unreadable. Rachel, he said, his tone guarded. Why did you agree to testify for the defense? She sighed, crossing her arms. I didn't have a choice. They subpoenaed me. You could have told them the truth, Liam said, his voice rising. You know I've never crossed the line. I did tell the truth, she shot back. But this case isn't just about you, Liam. It's bigger than that. People are watching, and they're looking for someone to blame. Liam stared at her, a mix of anger and betrayal simmering beneath the surface. I don't need excuses, Rachel. I need the truth to come out. She shook her head. Be careful, Liam. This case could ruin you if you're not careful. As she walked away, Liam felt a knot of frustration tighten in his chest. The trial was turning into a spectacle, and the truth seemed to be slipping further out of reach. But he wasn't about to give up. He had fought too hard and sacrificed too much to let someone like Renee Evans escape justice. That night, Liam sat alone in his small apartment, sifting through case files and evidence. He replayed the events of April 14th in his mind, searching for anything he might have overlooked. The image of Renee's smirk haunted him, a reminder that she was still in control of the narrative. But as he pored over the details, a thought struck him, a detail so small he had almost dismissed it. The second knife found in Renee's car hadn't been addressed in court. Why had she been carrying 2 weapons? And more importantly, what was she planning to do with them? Liam's mind raced as he pieced together a theory. Renee's attack hadn't been impulsive or panicked, it had been planned. The second knife was a backup, insurance in case her initial plan failed. But why? What was her motive? Determined to find answers, Liam reached for his phone and dialed Paxton's number. The case wasn't over, and he wasn't about to let Renee's smirk be the last word. As the third day of the trial began, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with anticipation. The media coverage surrounding the case had grown more intense, with news outlets spinning competing narratives about Renee Evans, Officer Liam Carter, and the justice system itself. Spectators filed into the gallery, their whispers weaving a tapestry of rumors and speculation. Officer Carter arrived early again, his demeanor as composed as he could manage despite the weight pressing on him. He had spent the previous night barely sleeping, consumed by the detail he had uncovered, the second knife in Renee's car. Its presence had been documented, but so far, it had been little more than a footnote in the proceedings. To him, it was a clue that could dismantle Renee's defense entirely. But getting it into the courtroom in a way that would stick was another matter. The judge entered the room, calling for order, and the trial resumed. Today, the prosecution had a crucial witness to present, a neighbor who had witnessed the confrontation between Liam and Renee from her apartment balcony. Mrs. Dolores Kinsey, an older woman with a sharp wit and a no-nonsense demeanor, took the stand. She adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat as Paxton approached. "Mrs. Kinsey, thank you for being here today," Paxton began, his tone respectful. "Can you tell us where you were on the evening of April 14th? "I was on my balcony, tending to my potted plants," she replied, her voice steady. "I like to sit out there and enjoy the fresh air before it gets too dark." "And did you observe anything unusual that evening?" Mrs. Kinsey nodded firmly. "I heard raised voices coming from the street below. When I looked down, I saw the officer and that young woman, the defendant, arguing near his patrol car." Paxton gestured for her to continue. "Can you describe what you saw next?" She was shouting at him, waving her arms around. He looked calm, too calm, if you ask me, for someone being yelled at like that. Then she pulled something from her pocket. I couldn't see what it was at first, but when the officer stepped back, I realized it was a knife. The courtroom was silent, hanging on her every word. "And what did Officer Carter do?" Paxton asked. "He told her to drop it," Mrs. Kinsey said. "I heard him loud and clear. But she didn't. She lunged at him. He managed to block her, but she didn't stop. It was like she wanted to hurt him no matter what." Paxton nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Kinsey. No further questions." When it was Monroe's turn to cross-examine, she approached with an air of condescension, her smile overly sweet. "Mrs. Kinsey, it's admirable that you're here today to testify. But let me ask you, how is your eyesight?" Mrs. Kinsey straightened in her chair, her expression hardening. "My eyesight is just fine, thank you." Monroe's smile didn't waver. "I'm sure it is. But you were observing this incident from your balcony, correct? How far above the street is that?" "About 3 stories, Mrs. Kinsey said, her tone clipped. "So you were at least 30 feet away, correct?" "Yes, but—" "And it was dark, wasn't it?" Monroe interjected. "You mentioned that you like to sit outside before it gets too dark, but surely by the time this confrontation happened, the light wasn't ideal." Mrs. Kinsey's lips pressed into a thin line. "It wasn't pitch black. There are streetlights." Monroe seized the moment. "Streetlights, yes. But wouldn't you agree that observing such a chaotic situation from that distance, in less than perfect lighting, could lead to misunderstandings?" "I know what I saw," Mrs. Kinsey snapped, her voice rising. Monroe stepped back, feigning an apologetic look. "Of course. No further questions." The tension in the room was palpable as Mrs. Kinsey left the stand. Liam felt a pang of frustration. The defense had managed to plant seeds of doubt in the jury's mind, despite the clarity of Mrs. Kinsey's testimony. The day pressed on, with more witnesses and arguments from both sides. But the moment Liam had been waiting for came late in the afternoon when Paxton addressed the court. "Your Honor," Paxton began, standing with a sense of purpose. "The prosecution would like to revisit an overlooked piece of evidence in this case, a second knife found in the defendant's car. We believe its presence is critical to understanding Ms. Evans' intent." Monroe immediately rose to object. "Your Honor, this is an attempt to introduce speculative evidence. The prosecution is grasping at straws." Judge Hawthorne raised a hand to silence her. "Mr. Paxton, do you have a compelling reason for introducing this now?" Paxton nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. This second knife suggests premeditation. It's not consistent with the defense's argument that Ms. Evans acted impulsively out of fear. We believe the jury has a right to hear this." After a moment's consideration, the judge allowed it. "Proceed, but tread carefully, Mr. Paxton." Paxton nodded and called the forensic analyst back to the stand. The analyst, a meticulous man in his 40s, was sworn in again and began recounting the details of the second knife. "This knife was found in the glove compartment of the defendant's car," he explained. "It's a folding knife with a serrated edge, significantly larger than the one she used during the altercation." "And was there any indication that this knife had been recently used?" Paxton asked. "There were no fingerprints or DNA evidence to suggest recent use," the analyst replied. "However, its location and condition suggest it was kept as a backup weapon." Monroe quickly objected. "Speculation." Sustained, Judge Hawthorne said. "Stick to the facts, Mr. Paxton." Paxton pivoted smoothly. "Let me rephrase. In your professional opinion, would the presence of a second knife suggest a level of preparation?" The analyst hesitated but nodded. "It could." The jury exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. Liam watched Renee closely during this exchange, hoping for a crack in her composure. But she remained as stoic as ever, her smirk only briefly faltering. Monroe's cross-examination was quick and sharp. She cast doubt on the relevance of the second knife, arguing that its mere presence didn't prove anything. "Ms. Evans could have forgotten it was even there," she said, addressing the jury directly. "How many of us have items in our cars that we don't think about daily?" The defense was skilled, but Liam knew this new detail had shifted the tide ever so slightly. As the day concluded and the judge dismissed the court, the air felt different. The case was growing more complex, and the jury seemed increasingly uncertain about which version of events to believe. That evening, Liam met with Paxton to discuss the day's developments. They sat in a quiet corner of a nearby diner, the smell of coffee and fried food hanging in the air. "I think we're making progress," Paxton said, though his tone was cautious. "The second knife raises questions, but we need more." Liam nodded, his mind racing. "What about her financials? She's claimed she was struggling to make ends meet, but what if that's not the whole story? What if there's a motive we haven't considered?" Paxton raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "I don't know yet," Liam admitted. "But I have a feeling we're missing something big." Determined to dig deeper, Liam spent the night poring over every detail of the case file, his eyes scanning for patterns or anomalies. And then he found it, a series of unexplained cash deposits into Renee's bank account, starting 3 months before the incident. The amounts weren't huge, but they were consistent, too consistent to be random. Liam's gut told him this was the key to unraveling Renee's smirk and the confidence she exuded in court. But what did it mean? Who was paying her, and why? The fourth day of the trial opened with an air of growing uncertainty. The courtroom, packed with spectators and journalists, buzzed with subdued whispers as everyone settled in their seats. The weight of the previous day's revelations still hung heavy in the air. Officer Liam Carter sat at the prosecution table, his jaw tight as he exchanged a quick glance with the prosecutor, Kevin Paxton. Both men knew they were closing in on something pivotal, but the full picture remained just out of reach. The judge called the court to order, and the proceedings began. Monroe, the defense attorney, wasted no time in attempting to seize the narrative again. Her confidence was apparent as she began questioning a character witness she had called to the stand, a coworker of Renee's from her part-time job at a local diner. The woman, a nervous redhead named Carla, fidgeted as Monroe addressed her. "Ms. Kinney, you've worked alongside Ms. Evans for several years, correct?" "Yes," Carla said softly, her voice barely audible. "And would you describe her as a violent or aggressive person?" Carla shook her head. "No, never. Renee's always been kind to me. She's the type of person who would give you the last dollar in her pocket if you needed it." Monroe smiled warmly, projecting sincerity. "Did she ever express any concerns or fears about her safety, particularly leading up to the night of the incident?" Carla hesitated for a moment before nodding. "She mentioned feeling like someone was watching her. She said she'd seen a car parked outside her apartment a few times. She thought it might be someone connected to her ex-boyfriend." This statement sent a ripple through the gallery. Monroe turned to the jury, her expression one of measured concern. Ms. Evans had reason to believe her life was in danger. This wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Liam clenched his fists under the table, resisting the urge to roll his eyes. Paxton, seated beside him, scribbled notes furiously. When it was his turn to cross-examine, he approached Carla with the calm precision of a surgeon. "Ms. Kinney," Paxton began, his voice steady, "you stated that Ms. Evans believed someone was following her. Did she ever report this to the police?" Carla looked uncomfortable. "I don't think so. She said she didn't trust the police." "Understandable," Paxton replied smoothly. "But isn't it also true that Renee has a history of conflicts at work? That she's been written up multiple times for confrontational behavior with customers and coworkers?" Carla's eyes widened slightly. "Well, she has a strong personality, but—" "A strong personality," Paxton repeated, his tone neutral. "Would you also describe threatening a coworker with a knife as having a strong personality?" The gallery erupted in gasps. Monroe leapt to her feet. "Objection. Relevance." Judge Hawthorne banged her gavel. "Sustained. Mr. Paxton, stay on topic." Paxton nodded, but the damage was done. Carla's unease was palpable, and the jury's expressions showed they had taken note. When the court adjourned for lunch, Liam stepped outside to clear his head. The crisp autumn air did little to ease his tension. He couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was still buried beneath layers of deception. The second knife, the cash deposits, everything pointed to a larger scheme. But what? As he paced near the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. It was a call from Detective Laura Daniels, a colleague he had asked to dig deeper into Renee's financial records. "I found something," Laura said without preamble. "Those cash deposits you flagged? They're tied to a local bail bondsman, Eric Trenton." Liam's brow furrowed. A bail bondsman? Why would Renee be getting money from him? "That's the interesting part," Laura continued. "Trenton's been under investigation for years. Rumor has it he's involved in illegal debt collection and intimidation tactics. Renee might have been working for him, or worse, she might have owed him." The pieces began to click into place in Liam's mind. If she owed him and couldn't pay, he might have forced her into something. "Exactly," Laura agreed. "But there's more. I pulled surveillance footage from a gas station near her apartment. A man matching Trenton's description was seen entering her building the week before the incident." Liam's pulse quickened. "We need to get this into evidence." "I'll send you everything I've got," Laura promised. Back in the courtroom, Paxton introduced the surveillance footage as evidence. Monroe objected vehemently, arguing that it was speculative and irrelevant, but Judge Hawthorne allowed it. The footage, grainy but clear enough to identify Trenton, was played for the jury. It showed him entering Renee's building late at night and leaving less than 15 minutes later. Paxton turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this footage raises a critical question. What was Eric Trenton, a known bail bondsman with a questionable reputation, doing at Ms. Evans' apartment? And why, shortly after this visit, did Ms. Evans receive a series of cash deposits linked to him?" Monroe countered during her cross-examination, attempting to discredit the footage. "The prosecution would have you believe this is some kind of smoking gun," she said, pacing in front of the jury. "But all it shows is a man visiting an apartment building. There's no evidence he even saw Ms. Evans that night." The days following the revelations about Eric Trenton felt like a slow descent into chaos. Officer Liam Carter and prosecutor Kevin Paxton had dug deeper into Renee Evans' connections, uncovering unsettling truths, but the full scope of the situation was still murky. Despite the mounting evidence, every new lead only seemed to draw them further into a web of lies, deception, and manipulation. Renee's behavior in the courtroom had become more erratic, her once confident smirk now replaced by a look of desperation and fear. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial entered its final days. The stakes were higher than ever, and every move felt critical. As the prosecution rested its case, Liam sat back in his seat, his mind racing. He had worked countless cases over the years, but this one felt different. The deeper he went, the more the case seemed to spiral out of control. The pieces were all there, but the puzzle remained incomplete. Renee Evans, the woman who had once appeared to be a cold-blooded assailant, was now emerging as something far more complex. Liam had seen it all before, crimes born of desperation, of anger, of fear, but this one didn't fit the usual patterns. There was more to Renee's actions than just a failed attempt to kill a police officer. The deeper Liam dug into her past, the more troubling details surfaced. It was as if her entire life had been a series of carefully crafted lies, a facade built to conceal something far darker. Prosecutor Paxton, for all his calm and composure in the courtroom, was growing frustrated. "We need to break her, Liam," he said one evening as they reviewed the latest batch of evidence. "There's more here than we realize, but she's holding on to something. We need to find out what." Liam leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "It's not just her. I'm starting to think there's someone else pulling the strings. Someone who wants to make sure Renee doesn't talk." "Trenton?" Paxton asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Liam nodded. "I'm certain of it. Trenton's been operating in the shadows for years. Renee is just a pawn in a much bigger game." The trial had already shaken the community to its core. What had initially seemed like a simple case of an attempted murder had transformed into a complex tale of debt, coercion, and manipulation. The residents of the small town, many of whom had once known Renee as a waitress at the local diner, were struggling to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the person now on trial for her life. It wasn't just Renee who had changed, it was everyone's perception of her. As the final days of the trial approached, Liam felt a growing sense of urgency. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that there were forces at play beyond what anyone had initially understood. Eric Trenton, the shady bail bondsman, had been the linchpin in the whole affair, but what role had Renee played in his operation? What was her connection to the underworld that had so easily ensnared her? In the quiet moments between sessions, Liam found himself replaying the events of that fateful night in his mind. The confrontation with Renee had been intense, and he could still feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins as he'd apprehended her. But as the days passed, he began to question everything. The smirk on her face, the coldness in her eyes, had it been an act? Or was it the defense mechanism of someone who had been backed into a corner and had nowhere to turn? The next witness called to the stand was Detective Laura Daniels, who had worked tirelessly on the case with Liam. Her testimony was crucial. She had spent weeks tracking down the various connections between Renee and Trenton, piecing together the puzzle that was rapidly becoming too complex for anyone to handle. Laura stepped up to the witness stand with a calm and collected demeanor, ready to present the evidence that would hopefully close the case once and for all. Detective Daniels, can you explain to the court what you uncovered during your investigation into Ms. Evans? Paxton asked, his voice steady and authoritative. Laura nodded, glancing at Renee briefly before beginning her testimony. After reviewing Renee Evans' financial records, I found several large, unaccounted-for cash deposits. These deposits were traced back to Eric Trenton's bail bonds company. Initially, it appeared to be a simple transaction, payments for services rendered. However, as I dug deeper, I found that these payments didn't align with any legitimate transactions. What do you mean by that? Paxton pressed. There were no records of Renee ever posting bail for anyone, nor did she ever appear to be in legal trouble herself. Yet, these deposits kept coming in. I also discovered that she had been in contact with Trenton several times before the incident on April 14. Laura's eyes met the jury's, and she let the weight of her words sink in. It became clear to me that Renee was involved in something far more dangerous than simple debt collection. She was caught in a dangerous cycle, forced into a situation where she had no control over her actions. She was working for Trenton, but it wasn't by choice. She was being manipulated. Renee's head snapped up at this revelation, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of fury and fear. The courtroom was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Laura's statement had hit its mark. The jury was no longer looking at Renee as a cold-blooded criminal. They were beginning to see her as a victim, trapped in a web of coercion and intimidation. But there was more to the story than just Renee's involvement with Trenton. Laura continued, in the days leading up to the attempted shooting, I discovered that Renee had been receiving threats. We found records of texts and calls, threats to harm her family if she didn't comply with Trenton's demands. Paxton's voice softened, but his words were still sharp. So, in a sense, Renee was forced into committing this crime? Laura nodded. Exactly. While her actions were wrong, they were not entirely her own. She was under duress. And while we can't absolve her of responsibility, it's important to understand the full context of what led to that night. There was a collective murmur in the courtroom as the jury absorbed Laura's testimony. Renee, who had once been viewed as a villain, was now seen in a new light. The question of guilt remained, but the question of motive had shifted. Could a person be blamed for their actions if they were acting under coercion? It was a question that weighed heavily on everyone in the room. As the day wore on, the defense continued to argue that Renee's actions were a result of mental instability, citing her troubled past and history of anxiety. Monroe presented several expert witnesses who testified to Renee's psychological state, painting a picture of a woman who was fragile and easily manipulated. But Paxton countered with the evidence of Trenton's involvement, framing it as a deliberate act of control rather than an unfortunate byproduct of mental illness. By the time the final arguments were made, the jury had been left with a difficult decision. Renee had been manipulated, but did that excuse her actions? Could a person be a victim of their circumstances and still be held accountable for the harm they caused? The answer was not clear, and as the jury was sent to deliberate, everyone in the room knew that the decision would have far-reaching consequences. Liam stepped outside the courthouse for a moment to clear his mind. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the steps. His thoughts were a whirlwind. The truth about Renee's involvement in the crime was beginning to come into focus, but it felt like the case was still far from over. Trenton was still out there, still a threat. And Renee, whether she was guilty or not, would never be the same again. As Liam walked back into the courthouse, he knew that the trial was about more than just Renee's fate. It was about exposing a much larger criminal network, one that had been operating under the radar for far too long. And while the courtroom drama was drawing to a close, the real work was just beginning. The jury returned, and everyone in the courtroom fell silent as Judge Hawthorne read the verdict. The room was thick with tension, but it was clear that no matter the outcome, the community would never be the same. The fallout from Renee Evans' actions would echo through the town for years to come. But for now, as the judge pronounced the verdict, all anyone could do was wait and wonder what would happen next. The days after the verdict felt like a blur to everyone involved. The tension in the courtroom had simmered down, but the ripple effects of Renee Evans' trial would reverberate through the town and beyond for years to come. For Liam Carter, the conclusion of the trial marked the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another, more uncertain one. The justice system had done its job, Renee had been sentenced, but that sense of finality was not as comforting as it should have been. The case had turned out to be far more complicated than anyone had anticipated, and the true extent of the criminal enterprise behind Renee's actions was far from clear. Liam stood outside the courthouse after the trial's conclusion, watching as the townspeople slowly filtered out, their faces a mix of relief and uncertainty. The events that had unfolded over the past few weeks had shaken the community to its core. People who had once known Renee as a friendly, hard-working woman now saw her in a completely different light. But even with her conviction, many couldn't quite shake the nagging feeling that the case had been more about the puppet masters behind the scenes than the woman at the center of it all. "I thought we had it all wrapped up," Liam muttered to himself, his gaze drifting over the empty courthouse steps. He had believed the trial would offer clarity, that the legal process would provide some sense of resolution, but now he was unsure. Renee, despite her conviction, was still just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Eric Trenton, the man who had seemingly manipulated her into attempting the murder of Officer Carter, was still out there, and the network of criminals involved in this scheme was likely far more extensive than anyone had originally realized. Liam turned his attention back to the courthouse, where Prosecutor Paxton was deep in conversation with his legal team. The usually composed prosecutor now looked weary, as though the weight of the trial had finally caught up with him. Paxton had fought hard for justice, but there was no denying the lingering sense that something was still missing. They had all focused so much on Renee's actions that they had failed to uncover the full extent of the web of lies and manipulation that had ensnared her. "You did good work, Carter," Paxton said as he approached, clapping a hand on Liam's shoulder. "We got her convicted. That's something. But I know you're feeling the same way I am, there's more to this." Liam nodded, his mind racing. "I can't shake the feeling that Trenton's just the tip of the iceberg. We've only scratched the surface, and we still don't know what kind of operation we're really dealing with." Paxton's eyes narrowed, and he leaned in, speaking in a low voice. "There's something else you should know. We've been following up on some of the evidence we found in Trenton's office. Turns out, he's got connections that go deep. We're talking to federal agents now, and the investigation is expanding." Liam felt his heart race. "You mean?" Paxton gave a grim nod. "I mean that this wasn't just a local bail bondsman running some shady deals. There's a bigger picture here: drug trafficking, money laundering, and possibly even human trafficking. Trenton was only a middleman." Liam clenched his fists, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a case of a woman caught up in the wrong circumstances, it was a dangerous, criminal network operating right under their noses. The fact that Renee Evans had been manipulated into a deadly act was tragic, but it paled in comparison to the broader implications of what they had just uncovered. "We've got to take this to the next level," Liam said, his voice tinged with determination. "This isn't over. Trenton may be convicted, but the people he's working with, they're still out there." Paxton hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I agree. But we need to be careful. This kind of operation runs deep. We can't just go charging in without the proper support." Liam turned away, his thoughts consumed by the enormity of the situation. The small town they had known, the one where people lived simple, quiet lives, was now a backdrop to something far more sinister. The very foundation of their community had been shaken, and the scars from this trial would linger for years to come. As the days passed, Liam continued to work with Paxton and the federal authorities to investigate Trenton's operations. They pored over evidence, tracked down leads, and worked tirelessly to uncover the full extent of the criminal enterprise. But as the investigation unfolded, the sense of urgency grew. There were whispers of more arrests to come, more criminals to be caught, and the possibility that the whole case was only the beginning. The town itself was torn. Some residents felt a sense of relief after the trial's conclusion, thinking that justice had been served and that they could return to their lives. But others, particularly those who had known Renee, were still struggling to reconcile the woman they had once trusted with the person who had attempted to kill a police officer. For them, the trial had been a painful reminder of the fragility of trust and the hidden dangers that could be lurking in their own backyard. Liam had always known that his job as a police officer was about more than just enforcing the law, it was about protecting people, making sure they were safe from harm. But this case had changed the way he saw his work. It wasn't just about catching criminals, it was about understanding the forces that pushed ordinary people to make choices that defied logic and reason. Renee Evans wasn't just a criminal. She was a victim of a system far larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. In the quiet moments of reflection, Liam couldn't help but think about her, the woman who had tried to take his life. He thought about her smirk in the courtroom, her defiant attitude, and the fear that had crept into her eyes when the truth began to unravel. What had driven her to this point? Was she truly evil, or had she been manipulated beyond her control? Could anyone truly be blamed for their actions if they had been pushed to the edge by forces they couldn't understand? The questions lingered, unanswered. And as Liam sat in his office late one evening, staring at the mountain of evidence still left to sift through, he realized that the real story wasn't about the trial. It wasn't about Renee or even Trenton. It was about the hidden world that had operated in the shadows, right under their noses. It was about the things people didn't want to see, the things they chose to ignore because it was easier than facing the truth. In the end, this case would be a turning point for Liam Carter. It would change the way he looked at crime, at justice, and at the people who walked through the doors of his precinct. But it would also serve as a reminder to the community, sometimes, the most dangerous threats aren't the ones we see coming. Sometimes, they're the ones hiding just beneath the surface. As Liam stood up to leave the office that night, he glanced at the small framed photo of his family on his desk. It was a reminder of why he did the job in the first place, to protect the people he loved. But now, with everything that had happened, he knew that the world was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. And no matter how hard they tried, justice could never be as simple as it seemed. The town would move on, slowly but surely, as towns always did. Renee would serve her time, and perhaps some of the people who had once trusted her would find it in their hearts to forgive her. But as Liam stepped out into the cool night air, he knew that things would never be the same. Not for him, not for the town, and certainly not for the people who had been caught in the web of Eric Trenton's empire. There was no going back. And as the investigation into Trenton's operation continued, Liam knew one thing for certain: the story was far from over.